Chaos in the Commons over votes for a ceasefire in Gaza. Charities are in despair, describing tonight's events as a disgrace. They're not the only ones asking questions of the UK's role on the world stage. Tonight, cries for help from Sudan will bring you an eyewitness report from the orphanage, home to some 3 million children displaced by war.
I can't even tell you how much we've been impacted, says Nermat. Even within the family, there's been damage.
I'll ask whether Rwanda is fanning the flames of war in the Congo. The United States and the UN say yes. Will the UK change its stance? Now, the major question tonight is Britain fueling Putin's war machine. We'll bring you a special investigation into UK exports on how British weapons could be helping Russia's war effort. And after 2 failed launches, should we be worried about the UK's nuclear deterrent? We'll debate with tonight's panel. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. How does Britain want to be seen on the world stage? Well, it's probably not the images we've seen tonight in Parliament. Voting for a ceasefire in Gaza descended into chaos. It went so badly, there's now calls for the Speaker to resign. Charities are in despair, with Oxfam describing the scenes as a disgrace. All the fallout coming up shortly. We're also going to bring you an extraordinary Sky News investigation looking at whether Britain is helping to fuel Putin's war machine. The findings are pretty stark. There's also some major questions about the UK's relationship with Rwanda. I'll take a closer look at claims it's helping rebels fight a war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in a moment, an eyewitness report from Sudan, where conflict has displaced more than 3 million children. The world is watching how the UK responds to all those crises. Can and should we do more to help? Well, that's down to those in the Commons, where MPs have tonight been accused of playground politics at a time when lives are at stake. Well, let's go straight now to our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. And Sam, as we've been reporting, I mean, this really was a chance to talk about the situation in Gaza. Instead, it's turned into chaos in the House of Commons.
Extraordinary and unedifying scenes in the Houses of Parliament this evening. Yalda, now, as you say, this was a moment where MPs were meant to debate and vote on what they think should be going on in the Middle East. Should there be a ceasefire or not in Israel in their war with Hamas? What should be going on in the next few weeks should Israel go ahead with that threatened incursion into deeper into the West Bank? But instead, it all descended into scenes of farce as the 3 biggest parties, Conservative, Labour and the SNP, put competing motions down, propositions, what they believe should be going on in the Middle East. All of them difficult, particularly for the Labour Party. And then there was as it were, unprecedented decision by the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, earlier today to rip up the rules for how these debates and votes are conducted in a way that many in the Commons felt favoured the Labour Party, ensuring that the Labour Party plan, the Labour Party motion would be voted on under the existing rules, the existing guidance. That wouldn't have happened, and saving Keir Starmer from an embarrassing rebellion that could have seen members of his front bench resign. So as a result, there is tonight an extraordinary row going on about the role of the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, who is fighting for his political career under pressure potentially to resign. I just want to show you this moment from earlier this evening where Lindsay Hoyle comes back to the Commons chamber, to the seat of the Speaker at the end of the day in order to apologise, and listen to the crackle in his voice as he says sorry to all the MPs that he's meant to oversee.
And I've got to say, I regret how it's ended up. It was not my intention. I wanted all to ensure they could express their views and all sides of the House could vote.
And Sam, what have the parties had to say about tonight's events?
Well, I think that the Labour Party's motion effectively went through, so they are the least unhappy. But I think that many MPs are feeling effectively ashamed of the circus, and I think there's no no other way of putting it, that saw proceedings descend into farce. An attempt at one point to force the Commons to sit in private delayed the key votes by some 20 minutes. But the key thing this evening is whether or not different parties in the House of Commons come out against the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, for this allegation of partisanship. Tonight, 33 MPs have signed a motion of no confidence. Some Tories are calling privately for Lindsay Hoyle to step down. Some on the Labour left think that he is probably going to have to resign. But most critically of all, Lindsay Hoyle appears to be on the verge of losing support completely of the third biggest party in the Commons. That's the SNP. Listen to the extraordinary anger in the voice of the SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, here.
Mr. Speaker, whilst I acknowledge your apology, the reality is that you were warned by the clerks of the House that your decision could lead to the SNP not having a vote on our very own opposition day.
How much longer? So there you have Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader, who basically making clear this evening he may no longer support Lindsay Hoyle. The Speaker might be the casualty, but what's the overall result for the public at home and for what's going on in the Middle East? Well, to be honest, Yalda, almost nothing. These are symbolic motions. It won't have changed anything other than the spectacle of MPs making, frankly, a fool of themselves at points over one of the most difficult international issues they were trying to debate.
Sam, thanks so much for bringing us up to date. Let's bring in tonight's panel, contributing editor at Novara Media, Michael Walker, and Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. I mean, Alan, a circus, a disgrace, shameful. It doesn't change anything at home, as we were hearing there from Sam, but just their inability to sort of have an actual debate and discussion.
Just extraordinary. I mean, here you have an important international issue that I think everyone wanted to have some discussion over. The whole saga started because the Labour Party was scared of addressing the SNP's motion. The Conservatives got in on the game by throwing in a wrecking amendment, as it were, but they're entitled as a government. And then the extraordinary spectacle of the Speaker taking this amendment from Labour in clear contravention of precedent in the House of Commons and then having to apologise for it. The whole thing has collapsed into a charade, and it's just shameful.
Michael?
I mean, in terms of parliamentary sort of manoeuvring, Labour are going to be very pleased because they've avoided a vote that they would have found awkward. I do think it seems like Lindsay Hoyle acted against precedent, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has to resign. I would push back against the idea that because this is a farce, we can assume none of this mattered. Because I do think this vote in Parliament mattered. Keir Starmer is very likely to be the next Prime Minister. And this was really a test of him. So the SNP put down a very clear motion, which was calling for an immediate ceasefire and saying that Israel is sort of carrying out collective punishment against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Now, for me, it would be important to see whether or not Keir Starmer is willing to stand behind a strong position such as that. I mean, obviously he wasn't. He was going to whip against it. But he was going to face a rebellion from his MPs, who, again, are likely to be the MPs in government soon. And so I think it would have been really important for that SNP motion to be heard and to be voted on, because, you know, now Labour say, oh, we've passed our motion, but that's because no one else voted. And also, by the way, it's a much weaker motion than the SNP's was in the first place, because it gives Israel loads of get-out clauses. Yes, let's have a ceasefire, but only if you can assure Israelis that they'll never be subject to an October the 7th style attack.
Well, while we continue to sort of debate this, though, you know, the war rages on, ultimately.
Exactly. But again, I'm not saying you're trying to do this at all, but there is a sort of danger, I think, of saying, oh, look at us here, it doesn't matter what we say. Britain has a seat on the Security Council, a permanent member of the Security Council. We fund Israel. If we wanted, we could have some serious influence. We could say to Israel, you don't get to use 100 hostages as a reason to carry out a total war against one of the most densely populated parts of the world, right?
I'm definitely not saying we don't have influence.
No, I know you're not saying that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think I would have liked a debate on the subject because I'm quite convinced the House of Commons would have come to a different place. I don't think they would have taken Michael's point there. I don't think they'd have voted for the SNP amendment. I think a majority of the House of Commons would quite comfortably have voted for a fair ceasefire that starts with hostages, Israeli hostages, being released, which then goes into what happens after that and the question of where Hamas stands on this situation, and would come out in a fair place. Everyone, including Israel, and I think, is looking for a way out of this conflict, for it to end. But it has to end not on the idea that the Israelis are somehow responsible for the mess, but that Hamas is, which Hamas was from day one.
Well, I mean, I suppose my interpretation of the Henry Jackson Society, you're supposed to be hard-headed realists. Now, why would Hamas accede to Israel's demand? So Israel is essentially saying, release all the hostages, we might have a break for a few weeks, and then we will start bombarding Gaza again until we have completely destroyed you. What organisation in the world is going to agree to those terms? So,
well, don't start a conflict that you're going to inevitably lose. It'll force you into that position.
So now you're talking about collective punishment, I think, which is precisely the issue
I'm
that was
talking
going to be
about Hamas being
debated
forced
in
out.
Parliament.
Hamas being forced out.
Well, so there's two issues, isn't there? Hamas being forced out of government and Hamas being totally destroyed. Now, I think what the Israelis are showing they want to do is to completely flatten Gaza. 70% of buildings currently destroyed, 29,000 people dead. Now, they would say this is so that we can be safe in the future and this is so we can get Hamas out of power. You've also got ministers very high up in that government, the finance minister, the security minister, sort of heading up conferences where they're talking about resettling Gaza. So I think to sort of play along with this Israeli idea that this is a defensive war.
I don't think it's playing along. I think the reality is that were the hostages to be released tomorrow, were Hamas to leave tomorrow, don't mean military smash, but actually leave.
Surrender and
leave.
What does that mean?
Well, Yasser Arafat left Beirut in 1982. He left Beirut and he went to Tunis, basically. That was enough from that situation to say that the PLO had gone.
And that's also when we had the Sabra and Shatila massacre, right? So the PLO left and then Israel allowed fascist Lebanon
down to the
troops
PLO sort of situation. The reality here is Hamas have to go, because you talk about hard-headed realism. There can only be movement and proper peace in this region if Hamas is not a part of it. Hamas has no role here.
Alan, are you saying wave a white flag, say we surrender?
Yes. I'm saying accept the inevitable. You started a war that you didn't think would end in this way. You thought somehow that it would end in a different way, and you have to accept responsibility for your actions. And if you care about your people, you should leave now, and the war ends tomorrow. Remember that, it ends tomorrow.
So I think we've got a problem where you're saying they started it, so Israel is justified in anything it's done. Now, that's exactly what people who defended Hamas on October the 7th would say. Israel occupied Gaza, they've been occupying it for 56 years, and therefore they have to accept the response. Under international law, it's been under occupation, because they control what goes in and what comes out.
Egypt, there's a country called Egypt to the south of Gaza, which also has control. So the idea that Israel is in charge of this is nonsense, geographically nonsense.
But it's territory controlled by Israel.
OK, well, we've got literally no time left on this topic. We will continue the conversation and we'll also keep talking about this issue. Now let's go to the rest of the news. A brutal conflict has gripped Sudan for more than 300 days. UNICEF says the country is struggling with the world's largest child displacement crisis. Our Africa correspondent, Yusra El-Bagir, has travelled to an orphanage in the city of Kassala, where some of the country's most vulnerable people are sheltering. From there, she sent us this report.
This war has spared no one, uprooting the country's most vulnerable, struggling to get through each day of uncertainty and fear. The school in Kassala is now a shelter for displaced people with disabilities. Here they're relatively safe, but forced out of the homes built around their needs. 3 million children in Sudan are now displaced, and amongst them are those who need extra care. It's the largest child displaced population in the world, and the UN's migration agency says over 2.1 million are under the age of 5. Aida's 2 young daughters are unable to walk or talk. She says before the war they were seeing doctors and physiotherapists. After war broke out, all of that stopped. The shelter is full of damaged prosthetics and wheelchairs. Insaf's broken wheelchair is a reminder of how and why they fled Khartoum. I can't run, so when the shell fell on our home, I rushed to use my wheelchair and it broke, she says. My mother had no choice but to fix it with rope from the bed. Their mothers bear the brunt of upheaval, trying to care for them through it all. I can't even tell you how much we've been impacted, says Ni'mat. Even within the family, there's been damage. These are the lucky ones. Less than 40% of 32,000 registered disabled residents of Khartoum state have managed to escape the violence. And those who've made it here are still working through the scars. A group initiative by Kassala's secondary school students is providing them with psychosocial support. Volunteering has such vital importance. It's something we want to do and see it as the least we can do, says Tasneem. Their city is now housing thousands of displaced people. And at the foot of the mountain is another shelter.
This school is also a sanctuary for some of the country's most vulnerable, orphaned children, who've had to be evacuated not once, but twice since the start of this war.
All of these children come from care homes in besieged areas. Those from the capital's Al Meigoma orphanage fled to safety and were trapped by violence again when the Rapid Support Forces advanced on their new home. Videos of them crying as the siege was underway was shared as a call for help, with a message from a resident turned caretaker expressing their abandonment.
The day I made the appeal, children died. Children who needed blood transfusions, who had severe malnutrition, and their carers had fled the home. The situation was really severe.
253 young orphans were evacuated here by UNICEF. 5 of them have died since, and 15 have been adopted. The rest of them fill the rooms of this building. Infants with no beds and a few donated mattresses. The remaining vulnerable children were brought here by local volunteers, now sleeping under tents outside. Already born into a tough life, now facing the worst of war. Yusra Al-Baghir, Sky News, Kassala.
OK, let's bring in Yusra to speak to us now. And Yusra, I mean, well done with all of your reporting on Sudan over the past few weeks. This truly is a forgotten war. And, you know, according to the UN, Sudan is the world's largest, as you've reported, internal displacement crisis. The question is, where to from here?
We were able to spend those 2 weeks really putting faces and names to those millions reported by the UN that were displaced. And I think with each family we met, we were more and more shocked, more and more upset by the fact that this is continuing to escalate, that there really hasn't been any intervention that has even calmed fighting down to the point where aid can successfully enter the areas that have been hit the hardest. And to see children who already have such a difficulty navigating life being ripped apart from other family members who understand what they're going through, but also taken away from the homes that are built around their needs was incredibly despairing. But again, all that we've seen is the tip of the iceberg. This is affecting nearly 25 million people who are now in need of humanitarian assistance, and the UN is struggling really to garner the donations, the $4.1 billion that are needed in order to address these humanitarian needs. And I think talks have definitely stalled. Last year, we saw talks in Jeddah between the army and the RSF that promised a humanitarian aid mechanism that hasn't held true to the ground. The army maintained that that is the only mediation mechanism that they adhere to, even as we hear reports about more mediation happening in Bahrain and reports today that they will meet again in Jeddah in March. I did put that forward to the office of Army Commander Abdel Fattah Burhan. They've denied any reports of them meeting in March. And really, we have to accept or acknowledge the fact that the army is embarrassed by the notion of sitting at a table with the leadership of troops that have occupied the capital, that have
killed thousands of people, that have, pillaged entire villages and entire cities. So there's a lot of pressure on the army to keep fighting. We did report last week that they had made significant gains in the capital, in Durman, and that those gains continued throughout the week. But again, there's a catch-22 here, which is how long will people wait until the army effectively win this war, enough for them to return to their homes? And in the meantime, can there be enough of a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities for aid to reach them, or for them to be able to survive a crisis that is killing more people every day, displacing more people every day, and descending into absolute chaos?
Yeah, and Yusra, I mean, this is also beyond just two generals sitting at a table discussing a potential truce. There are external influences at play here as well, that it is in some ways almost a proxy war that's also taking place, with both sides being influenced and funded and supported by different states.
Absolutely. Every time there seems to be a lull, there's some sort of injection coming in from external players that fuel the fighting further. We've seen Washington consistently over the last few months put pressure on the UAE, which has been accused of supporting the RSF, accusations that have been supported by widespread evidence that they have been in an arms deal of sorts with the RSF in exchange for gold. We've also seen Iran now supporting the army, the Sudanese armed forces. I think people really underestimate how critical Sudan's stability is, not only to the continent, but to the world. Sudan does have access to the Red Sea. We've got a Red Sea coast. There's also significant amounts of gold, of uranium in the country. And essentially, if Sudan's security is on the line, that gives bad actors carte blanche to descend upon the country and to exploit not only the gold and uranium, but also access to the Red Sea. And we've seen over the last month just how critical the Red Sea is to world trade. So I think there needs to be more of an acknowledgement that unless there is stability in the country, then we will see definitely fallout, not just across the region, but across the world.
Yusra, thanks again for joining us. Lots more still to come on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. We'll be looking at whether the UK should be doing more to prevent conflict in the Congo, plus how the UK is inadvertently helping Vladimir Putin's war effort in Ukraine. Sky News analysis shows a huge rise in trade with Russia's neighbours, which could be breaching sanctions. Plus, embarrassment for the government after it was forced to admit a Trident missile misfired during testing. Where does it leave the reputation of NATO's nuclear deterrent?
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Welcome back. Let's turn now to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where rebels continue to spark violence across the region. The United Nations and United States have accused Rwanda of supporting one of the groups. With the UK strengthening ties with Rwanda through its immigration plans, will the UK change its stance? Let's just take a listen. A brutal conflict has raged in the Democratic Republic of the Congo for more than 30 years. Some locals call it the war without end. But with the conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East, it's been pushed further out of the spotlight.
The crisis in the DRC is one of the most severe, complex, prolonged, protracted and neglected in the world.
Now, neighbour Rwanda is being accused of fanning the flames of violence. So what's happening in the DRC? It's the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa and sits in the centre of the continent. Decades of complex conflicts, proxy wars and UN intervention. The Congolese government struggling to maintain control. One of now an estimated 140 rebel groups operating in the east is called the M23 movement. First emerging 10 years ago, M23 resurfaced in early 2022, seizing territory along the country's eastern border. There's fears the regional capital, Goma, could soon fall under its control. It briefly did in 2012. It's left thousands displaced.
We saw soldiers fleeing with their weapons. They said that the M23 were coming, and we were all forced to flee.
Bombs are being dropped in the city, so we have to flee because there's a risk of dying there.
But where does the M23's strength come from? The US and UN have joined the DRC in accusing Rwanda of backing the rebels.
Rwanda must end its support to M23. It must also withdraw Rwandan forces from Congolese territory.
It's been denied by the M23 and Rwanda, who neighbours the DRC to the east. With the United States now taking such a strong stance, it's raised questions for the UK about its rhetoric.
Unequivocally, Rwanda is a safe country.
An alliance tightening. Britain sent £240 million to Rwanda to help take in asylum seekers. But should it be rethinking that relationship? On the ground, there's anger at foreign nations.
We want to show the whole world that our people are being killed in the east, but you foreigners are keeping silent. Rwanda is supporting the rebels, but you are just looking on.
It's God who created us Congolese. We are not the ones who told him to put all the precious minerals in our soil.
Those minerals he's talking about include cobalt, a precious resource used to power our tech devices. DRC has it in spades. In 2017, a Sky News investigation found children as young as 4 working in Congolese mines where cobalt is extracted for smartphones. The Congolese army says neighbours Rwanda and other global players are not just waging war on the battlefield, but an economic war too, in order to boost their own wealth. For now, the resource-rich DRC remains one of the world's poorest countries. And as violence looks set to only continue, a humanitarian crisis deepens. Well, we asked the Foreign Office for a response to our report, but they haven't yet provided a comment. Let's bring our panel back into the discussion. I mean, you know, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a very complex place, a complex conflict that doesn't feel like it has any kind of war end to the war. And now we're hearing and seeing Rwanda's role in this. Obviously, you know, there is a very tense situation here because the US and the UN have both condemned Rwanda's role and said that, you know, they need to get their boots off the ground. They need to stop supporting this militia group. The UK hasn't said anything yet.
Well, I suppose, you know, we can't pretend that the UK could snap its fingers and stop conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But it is worrying that there seems to be this conflict of interest that we won't get involved now. We're already paying them £240 million for a scheme which hasn't worked. And now it seems like we're sort of changing our diplomatic stances based on this imaginary policy that's probably never going to come to fruition.
Well, it only hasn't worked because it hasn't been allowed to work in that sense. It might work if it was ever given that chance. But on the DRC front, the problem is that Rwanda has had a long history of involvement in the country. And let's not forget the genocide against the Tutsis was in part engineered from within Zaire, as it was, which led to a counter-offensive eventually from Rwanda into Zaire. And, of course, there's been interest since. So this is a very complicated thing. And to boil it down to just one militia right now, I don't think it's a fair analysis. However, what I would say is if the US and others have condemned Rwanda for getting involved in this, I don't think the fact that we've got a deal with Rwanda should make us scared of doing so.
So, the point there from both of you. We'll keep you here on set to continue the conversation. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up is the UK inadvertently helping Vladimir Putin's war effort in Ukraine, the stark findings of a Sky News investigation. Ahead of the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, new analysis by Sky News has revealed that UK companies are sending millions of pounds worth of sanctioned goods to Russia via neighbouring countries. Well, our economics and data editor Ed Conway joins me now. Ed, congratulations. This is a huge investigation, but sanctions were imposed and we were led to believe that they're working, and they have been working, but you found something else.
Well, I guess there's kind of an official story about what's happening with sanctions and then a kind of unofficial story. Shall I show you, actually? Because you get a sense of that official story when you look at the exports that are going to Russia. And so this is specifically exports from the UK to Russia. And what you see is kind of what you'd expect. So here they are before the invasion, and then after the invasion, they go down, and they go down quite sharply. And interestingly, when you kind of break it down into the stuff, you know, the particular items we're talking about, you know, it's machinery, it's motor vehicles, that basically goes off the edge of a cliff, that disappears after 2022. But here's the thing, OK, so if you're obviously, you know, a Russian company and you're used to getting your stuff from the UK, let's say it's kind of an item of heavy machinery, couldn't you just potentially just set up like a shell company in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, and then say, well, could you just send your stuff to Kyrgyzstan instead? And then the heavy machinery goes to Kyrgyzstan, and then it goes from Kyrgyzstan over to Russia, because at that point it's basically been like laundered. That's kind of laundry of exports. And we get a sense of whether that's actually happening when we look at the data for Kyrgyzstan. So again, this is UK exports to Kyrgyzstan. You can see it's a pretty straightforward story. It's almost flat up to the Russian invasion, and then those sanctions get imposed, and just look at that chart. I mean, it's extraordinary. And again, it's not just the shape of that, and that adds up. That's 1,100% up in terms of our exports to Kyrgyzstan. And it's not just the total numbers, it's also the kinds of things. So look, the red, that's heavy machinery. So it's heavy machinery, it's cars. It's exactly the kinds of things that we say that we're not sending to Russia, we're now sending to these places. And pretty much anyone, you know, if it looks like a, you know, a sanction-busting trade and smells like it, that's basically what it is. And we know that it's the same thing happening in much of the EU as well. So Germany, Poland, everyone is seeing the same kind of things in their figures. It's pretty extraordinary.
It's really extraordinary. Ed, what sort of stuff are we talking about?
I mean, this is where it gets, I mean, perhaps even more depressing and certainly pretty striking. So we kind of looked at some of that data, and all of this is official UK trade data. It's quite detailed, and you need to dig into it. And what we did was we looked at the data for places, you know, in the Caucasus. So some of these countries, not just Kyrgyzstan, but, you know, Georgia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. And when you look at specifically the kinds of items that we know have been discovered on battlefields that have come from, for instance, Europe, little microchips, you know, parts that go into drones. When you look at those items, and there's a list that the EU has of 45 things we just should not be sending anywhere near Russia, specifically at those items. Here, again, is the chart of those items, just the stuff we're sending and shouldn't be sending to these countries. And just look again at what happens. It's the same thing. It goes up by kind of, you know, 500% or so. And when you look specifically about the kinds of things that predominate that list, I mean, have a look at this. It's almost kind of unpalatable. You're talking about kind of drones, you're talking about, or parts that can be used to help reinforce and repair drones. You're talking about data processing equipment, you're talking about navigation equipment for planes, radio navigation aids. This, I should just underline, this is stuff we are sending from the UK to these countries on the satellites of Russia, which we know are then sending this stuff to Russia. So
which ends up killing Ukrainians.
It ends up reinforcing Vladimir Putin's war machine. And, you know, we are a part of this, and the UK, the government is aware of this, these government figures, but so far they have yet to actually do enough about it, really.
Do we know if they're going to do anything about it?
Well, we know they've got a new unit which they're setting up to try and reinforce the sanction policy. But, you know, a lot of people would say, well, you need to actually impose sanctions on Kyrgyzstan and some of these other places, but then that's awkward because there are diplomatic relations already in place with these places. But what it just underlines is how good Vladimir Putin and Russia is at reinforcing their war machine, and it explains why the Russian economy and the war machine in Russia is frankly doing very well at the moment, and Ukraine is struggling.
And as you say, the UK is not the only country that's doing this.
It's basically across Europe. It's mostly Europe, OK, but Germany, Poland, mostly Eastern Europe, mostly manufacturers. Everyone is at it, and a lot of people are looking at Europe and saying, you really need to do something about it.
Ed, extraordinary investigation. Thank you so much. That was Ed Conway with that investigation. So questions about how the UK weapons are being passed on to Russia. And there's questions here over the state of the UK's nuclear deterrent after a Trident II missile misfired for the second time. The UK's nuclear deterrent system consists of 4 nuclear submarines, at least one of which must be patrolling at all times ready to strike. As of 2010, each submarine could carry up to 8 Trident missiles, each armed with up to 40 nuclear warheads. Although the numbers are no longer publicly released and could have changed. The failed missile launch apparently occurred after the missile had been propelled into the air when its first stage boosters didn't ignite. The test took place on HMS Vanguard, one of the 4 nuclear submarines that first went on patrol in 1994. It's due to be replaced in the 2030s. In contrast, the United States has 14 nuclear submarines carrying up to 20 ballistic missiles and multiple warheads. Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, reports on the consequences of an embarrassing episode for the UK's military reputation.
The aim would have been a successful test fire like this one back in 2012. Instead, last month, a Trident missile launched from a nuclear deterrent submarine misfired and dropped into the ocean. It's the second malfunction in a row in a major embarrassment for the Royal Navy.
Good afternoon and a pleasure.
Ministers played down the failure and said HMS Vanguard had still been cleared to return to nuclear patrols.
All we are prepared to say is that there was this event-specific anomaly relating to the test firing, which means we are nevertheless confident that were it the case that we had to fire a strategic missile in anger, we would not have to deal with that issue.
The Defence Secretary and the head of the Navy had been on board the submarine off the coast of Florida when the misfire happened on the 30th of January.
So we stand shoulder to shoulder.
But it was business as usual, in public at least, when Grant Shapps met his American counterpart the very next day. The UK was only forced to come clean after a newspaper revealed the glitch.
There's no doubt it's embarrassing. It is embarrassing.
A former Navy chief said he's spoken to some of the crew involved.
It's quite deflating when you do it and it doesn't work. They know that what they did was absolutely spot on, and they are actually fairly buoyant, coming back to do their first of the patrols, having had the refit.
Keeping one of the Navy's 4 nuclear-armed submarines continuously at sea is the cornerstone of not just Britain, but all of NATO's defences, including here in Latvia. And it's not just about ensuring the boats, missiles and warheads work. The messaging around anything to do with the nuclear deterrent is also carefully controlled to avoid escalating tensions or exposing a vulnerability. It means the misfiring of the Trident missile, even though apparently it wasn't because of a problem with the weapon, sends the wrong kind of signal to Britain's enemies. And that's a concern for its friends. With security threats growing, now is not the time for confidence in the UK to shrink. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Latvia.
Well, I've got my panellists here. And Michael, I'm going to come to you just to pick up on Deborah's point there, that this is not just about it being embarrassing. This is about Britain's enemies watching closely, and any sign of weakness doesn't need to be shown.
Oh, no, I think you've got this wrong, because this was only a test situation. In the real thing, it would work, which is the line we're being fed by the Ministry of Defence, which is very bizarre. They're saying 2 tests in a row have failed, but these are test conditions which are different from real-world conditions, and in the real world, it will work. It's a bit like you sort of go to Toyota and say, sort of in the crash tests, all the dummies were decapitated, but we trust when it's real people, it will go OK. I don't understand whatsoever the line from the Ministry of Defence on this one.
Well, I'm going to be more charitable, saying that the technical details of Trident are such that I can believe that to be the case. However, I'm deeply concerned that this is the second launch in a row that hasn't gone successfully. We don't do launches that often. I mean, there have been about 190 successful ones in total, but the Americans are responsible for almost all. We have to have a deterrent that everyone understands is working, and given that the world is getting more complex, given it is getting more dangerous, given that other countries are indeed looking both for British protection, but also maybe to undermine us, we have to show that these systems work. And that is what the MOD is going to have to get its head around.
And for the longest time, the Americans behind closed doors were saying, look, you need to sort all this out. Now they're saying it publicly. In fact, some generals are publicly saying, we're not sure you're a reliable ally when it comes to these things.
Well, I think it's less to do with, obviously, this particular
angle.
But yes, collectively, I think this suggests that, as has been said for some time, the world is getting more complicated. We have ever more challenges rather than fewer. And as such, we must have the defence capabilities to match them and meet them and, frankly, exceed them. There's no point sort of playing catch-up. We've got to be ahead of the game. And I think that's what the Americans have been saying to us.
So, I mean, I suppose the problem with that narrative for me is you're sort of saying, look at the threats and then build a military accordingly. Now, I think to be realistic about this, you've got to recognise that a military is going to be somewhat proportionate to your economy. Now, I think the British, we've had this problem for a long time, which is that we still think that we should play the role that we did in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. So we've got this permanent seat on the Security Council because we won the Second World War. We are an independent nuclear power because for some reason we think we must have that stature. But we're 1% of the global population, 2% of its GDP. So, you know, you're saying we have to sort of increase spending to meet the challenges of the day. Now, I'm not necessarily saying cutting spending, but I'm saying, to me, it would be more realistic to say, what role do we actually want to play in the world?
Well, I think that's an important question to be debated, actually. You know, what role do the people of this country want us to play? And I think if it was put to them, you know, despite what you've said, Michael, I think people here still understand that a strong British defence capability is important for the free world to prosper and that threats to that way of life, the way of life that we want to see preserved and extended, will then be able to be defended by our own capabilities. So it is about our own national interests here.
Well, so I think what everyone will agree with is that everyone wants Britain to have good defence capacities. But I would say one way to sort of come to terms with our new position in the world is to say, let's actually make our defence industry about defence. And too often, I think the British have decided to invest in expeditionary warfare. We should be able to intervene anywhere. And, I mean, going back to what you said earlier, we seem to think that wherever the Americans go, we have to be able to go with them. And I think that's been disastrous in the last 2 decades.
Look, I think there have been examples when we haven't gone with the Americans, of course, and examples where we've gone and they haven't. I mean, Libya being a classic one there. The reality here is that I think we have to preserve offensive capabilities as well as defensive, because sometimes the best form of defence is attack. It just is realistic to do that. And if you get into a wholly defensive mindset, a good example was the French army in the interwar years, you end up having no sense of how to actually get round your opponent. And so you've got to have the offensive capabilities as well.
I mean, I think in theory that's perfectly coherent what you've said. I mean, if we do look at the last 25 years of history, though, I don't really think what you've said has accorded with what's happened. I don't think the offensive capabilities we've exerted in the Middle East, for example, have made British people safer. And I think that should be really the core and the basis on which we make these decisions.
20 seconds,
I think you're, on that one, I think you're confusing the difference between war fighting, which we're quite good at, and peace building, which we're not. And that's the difference. I think you're right that actually peace building has led to problems, but actually the war fighting has been very successful.
They only need to build the peace because they overthrew the government in the first place. But
OK, well, we'll leave it at that. Alan, Michael, thank you both for joining us here on the panel tonight. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, more on the chaos in the Commons as MPs squabble over a vote on a ceasefire in Gaza. We'll hear from Oxfam, who says it's a disgrace and sends a bad message to the world. Stay with us.
We're delighted to be reopening. As you say, we've been closed for the last 2 years. It's normally a very popular tourist destination, and we've needed to close just because we've had avian flu. We just thought that was the right thing to do at that time. Well, again, harking back to 2022, we had 6,000 carcasses were picked up by staff on the islands. Last year, delighted to say the numbers reduced by 39%. Down to just over 3,500. So whilst we can't conclude too much out of that, at least the trajectory seems to be about right. We're going to need another season at the very least just to find out if that's still descending, going in the right direction. But at the moment, the clues are that it's looking a little bit better. And what we do know is that across the UK at the moment, avian flu is at a much lower prevalence than it certainly has been. What we found is that the incidence of avian flu occurring across the country varies really quite considerably. So it might be quite prevalent on the East Coast, it's been less on the West Coast, it's been here, it's been there, and even between sort of neighbouring islands, so upstream as it were and downstream of us here on the East Coast, we've seen big differences in the prevalence of avian flu. So it is difficult to tell, but as I say, what we do know is suggests that the prevalence at the moment is very low. Yes, we're opening up later in March, absolutely. What they'll be seeing is as you're showing there, we'll be into Arctic tern season. That's the big one. That's one of the big draws, certainly. You've already mentioned puffins, of course. That's a particularly kind of favoured little bird. Everybody loves a puffin, I think. Yeah, so they'll be, there we go. Puffins will be kind of landing up in the next few weeks. Arctic terns will be here about mid-March, so about this time next year, starting to lay their eggs. Okay, it's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, but if you want to come visit and get dive bombed by Arctic terns, then that's what will be happening from, say, in about a month's time. They have this kind of very clear, bright blue strip when they're in the breeding season, but that does fade. It does fade later. So they go out to sea later in the year, at the end of the summer, and kind of tone themselves down. They don't need to be quite so bright and showy as they are.
Welcome back. Let's return to tonight's chaotic scenes in the House of Commons, where MPs were attempting to debate a motion supporting an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The handling of the vote went so badly, there's now calls for the Speaker of the House to resign. What message does it send to the world? Well, joining me now is Katie Chakraborty, Head of Policy and Advocacy at Oxfam. She's described tonight's events as a disgrace. Katie, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. I mean, this really was supposed to be a moment where there could be a discussion, a debate about the situation in Gaza, to talk about a potential ceasefire. Instead, it's turned into total chaos.
Absolutely. What the chance was tonight was for the UK Parliament to send a very clear moral and political message to the UK government, to allies such as the US, and yes, directly to the government of Israel and to Hamas as well, to stop the horrendous fighting that's seen nearly 30,000 people killed just in the last 6 months. And instead, what we got was a kind of procedural shrug, everyone scratching their heads, blaming each other, an emotion that kind of got through on points. And so we're in danger, really, of making this a story about us and our own politics, when, as you say, what we really need to be hearing about is the harrowing and horrendous atrocities going on in the Gaza Strip right now.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, virtually every night we cover the situation in Gaza, the situation currently in Rafah. We speak to people on the ground. But just talk us through what your staff, what your teams are seeing and doing on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked for Oxfam for nearly 15 years now, and to a certain extent, I've had to hear a lot from humanitarian crises around the world, but I've never had to listen to voicemails and voice messages from our own colleagues in the north who are saying they're lucky because they can find one meal a day to eat, and they know families who can't find anything for 3-4 days. Colleagues in Rafah, down in the south now, the place where Israel is threatening to take its military operation next, who this is the 4th place they've been displaced. They say they no longer dream of being safe. That's not what they're aiming for. They're just aiming to escape death on an hourly basis, a nightly basis. They're completely unacceptable, completely harrowing descriptions. The World Food Programme can now no longer deliver food aid to the north of Gaza. If people are not being bombed, they're being starved. And even if we did get a ceasefire today, we're likely to see estimates of thousands, up to 8,000 people is one of the recent estimations of people who will still die because of the diseases, the malnutrition that's become embedded in a population with no food to speak of, no water, and no functioning health system.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers, as you say, are horrendous. We were speaking to a young man, a doctor, in fact, who's now in Rafah yesterday, and he was pleading with the international community to do what they can to stop this conflict, to stop this war. And here we are tonight with, again, if we were to go full circle back, this chaos and this lack of leadership.
There are some clear things that could be done and should be done now, because many MPs actually took the opportunity this evening to stand up and to speak really boldly about what they're hearing is happening in the Gaza Strip. And I really hope ministers listened to that. It was MPs of all sides of the House, because the government needs to act. The votes that really matter are not the ones that are happening in the House of Commons. They're the ones that are happening at the UN Security Council, where the UK has a big voice and so far has abstained on any votes for a ceasefire. It needs to be voting for a ceasefire.
Katie, we've got about 15 seconds before we need to come off air, but we're grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
OK, that's it from the team and I. We'll be back again at 9 p.m. tomorrow. Good night.